She was fatally shot by two police officers who reported that she lunged at them with knives. What happened 5 years ago is now the focus of this inquest, and today was emotional right from the start.
Lying on my daughter, she gone. It hurts me.
That response from Charles Lyles, Charleena's father.
Seattle in 2017 was a city of contrasts. The tech boom had transformed it into one of the fastest-growing cities in America, its skyline bristling with new high-rises, its economy humming with the wealth of Amazon, Microsoft, and countless startups. But the prosperity was uneven. For working-class families, particularly families of color, life was a daily battle against rising rents, limited access to healthcare, and the weight of systemic inequality. Brettler Family Place, the housing complex, where Charleena lived, stood at the intersection of these contrasts. Built as part of an initiative to combat homelessness, it provided transitional housing for families who had been unhoused or at risk. For residents, it offered shelter and stability, but it was also a place marked by surveillance, stigma, and constant reminders of poverty. For Charleena, Brettler was both refuge and cage. She had a roof over her head and space for her children, but it wasn't a permanent home. The walls echoed with the sounds of dozens of families stacked side by side, each struggling with their own burdens. Police cars were not uncommon in the parking lot, responding to calls from residents navigating stress, disputes, and crises. Charleena, like many others, felt the dual pressure of needing police assistance at times, but also fearing how they might respond. Her daily life was demanding. As a mother of 4, pregnant with her 5th child, she bore the full weight of caregiving. Mornings were a blur of breakfast, getting kids dressed, and preparing them for school or daycare. Evenings were filled with homework help, cooking, cleaning, and the endless cycle of tending to her children's needs. The apartment was small, but it was alive with the energy of children, laughter, arguments, questions, and hugs. Her children depended on her entirely, and she embraced that role with love, though it came with exhaustion. Friends and relatives described her as a mother who doted on her kids, who tried to give them joy even when money was tight. She decorated their rooms with bright colors, scoured thrift stores for clothes and toys, and tried to keep routines that gave them stability. But the strain was real. Charleena received support from social services, but it was patchwork. Never enough to lift her fully out of poverty, only just enough to keep her afloat. She attended meetings with caseworkers, navigated complicated paperwork, and tried to stay compliant with requirements that often felt like hoops designed to trip her up. The stress of survival was relentless. That on top of financial struggles, Charleena wrestled with mental health challenges. She had documented struggles with anxiety and depression, and sometimes paranoia. People close to her said she could swing between moments of warmth and clarity to moments of agitation and fear. She had sought help but, like many Americans, found the mental health system inconsistent and difficult to access. Too often, her struggles were treated not with care, but with suspicion. Her interactions with the Seattle Police Department reflected this tension. In prior months, she had called police multiple times, often for legitimate concerns such as domestic disputes or fears of break-ins. But some of those encounters had escalated. On one occasion, she had been arrested after allegedly threatening officers with scissors during a mental health episode. That history was noted in police databases. Officers knew her name. Her apartment address carried a digital flag in the system. Officer Safety Caution. That label, more than anything, revealed the dangerous gap between how institutions viewed Charleena and who she actually was. To her children, she was mommy. To her neighbors, she was a young mother doing her best. To the police system, she was a risk that in the weeks leading up to June 2017, Charleena's stress deepened. Being pregnant while caring for 4 young children was overwhelming. Her mother recalled that Charleena was often tired, sometimes fearful, but determined to protect her kids. She had reported burglaries in the past, convinced that people were trying to enter her apartment. Whether those fears were rooted in real events or paranoia was debated, but to Charleena, the threat felt real. She had been trying to secure her apartment, putting up locks and asking for help with security. She wanted her children to feel safe. But Brettler Family Place, though designed to help families, was not immune to crime. Petty thefts, break-ins, and disputes among residents happened. Her concerns weren't unfounded. By mid-June, Charleena had grown increasingly anxious. She confided in relatives that she felt vulnerable, that she needed police to take her concerns seriously. She didn't want to be dismissed as the woman with mental health issues. She wanted to be treated as what she was, a mother trying to protect her family. That on the morning of June 18, 2017, when she believed a burglary had taken place in her apartment, she did what any citizen is told to do. She dialed 911. She reported the break-in calmly, asking for officers to respond. It was not the first time she had called for help, but she hoped this time would be different, that she would be heard, respected, and assisted. She could not have known that the response to her call would end her life. Sunday mornings at Bretler Family Place were usually quiet. Families lingered inside their apartments, preparing breakfast, getting children ready for church, or savoring rare moments of rest. On June 18, 2017, in apartment 124, Charleena Lyles began her morning like any other, surrounded by her children. 30 years old, Charleena was carrying the weight of motherhood heavily but lovingly. For children filled her small apartment, and she was pregnant with another. The living room was cluttered with toys, clothes, and the markers of everyday life. The kids ran around, giggling, occasionally bickering, then clinging to their mother for reassurance. That morning, Charleena believed her home had been burglarized. She noticed a missing video game console and perhaps other small items. It wasn't the first time she had worried about a break-in. She had called the police before with similar concerns, and though some dismissed her fears as paranoia, she was convinced someone had violated her home. For a woman already struggling with anxiety, the possibility of intrusion struck deep. At around 9:35 a.m., she picked up her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was steady but concerned. She reported a burglary and asked for officers to come to her apartment. The dispatcher logged the call and assigned 2 officers to respond. Those officers were Stephen McNew and Jason Anderson, both white men with years of service in the Seattle Police Department. As they drove toward Bretler Family Place, they already knew Charleena's name. Their patrol car computer had flagged her address. Hazard, officer's safety caution. They knew about her prior arrest involving scissors. They knew she struggled with mental health. They also knew there were children in the home. What they seemed not to know, or not to account for, was how to de-escalate a situation involving a vulnerable woman and her children. The officers arrived just before 10 a.m. They walked through the courtyard, past rows of apartments with peeling paint and the sound of televisions playing inside. They reached Charleena's door and knocked. She answered, letting them in. Inside, the apartment was dim, the air filled with the noise of children moving between rooms. Toys were scattered across the floor. Charleena explained that her Xbox had been stolen, along with some other belongings. She wanted to file a report. She wanted the police to take her seriously. McNew and Anderson began asking questions, moving around the apartment, taking notes. For several minutes, the encounter seemed calm. Body camera footage later released showed Charleena speaking with them in a steady voice, describing what had happened. Her children watched, curious, their small faces peeking from behind doorways. Then, something shifted. The officers claimed that Charleena suddenly pulled out a kitchen knife. They shouted commands, "Get back! Get back!" The footage went chaotic, the camera jolting as the officers backed into the tight space of the apartment. Charleena's children screamed. Within seconds, McNew and Anderson drew their weapons. In the confined space of the small apartment, with children only feet away, they opened fire. Charleena was struck multiple times. She collapsed to the floor, bleeding, her children crying out around her. The shots echoed through the walls of Bretler Family Place, neighbors jolting awake, some rushing into the courtyard to see what had happened. Inside, the chaos was unbearable. For young children had just witnessed their mother shot by the very people she had called for help. One of them later told investigators, "They shot my mom." Charleena lay dying as officers called for medics. But the damage was catastrophic. By the time paramedics arrived, she was gone. Her 5th child, still growing inside her, was gone, too. Outside, the courtyard filled with confusion and anger. Neighbors gathered, demanding to know why so many shots had been fired, why officers had used lethal force against a woman known to be vulnerable, why her children had been left to witness such horror. By noon, news of the shooting had spread across Seattle. Headlines carried the first details. Woman killed by Seattle police at Bretler family place. For many, the story was instantly recognizable. Another black woman dead at the hands of police. Another 911 call ending in gunfire instead of assistance. Charleena's family rushed to the scene. Her sister, her cousins, her father, they stood behind police tape, sobbing, shouting, demanding answers. How could this have happened? She had been the one to call for help. She had been the one who asked for protection for her children. The trauma was searing. They were taken from the apartment, their clothes stained, their eyes wide with shock. Social workers comforted them as best they could, but nothing could erase the images of that morning. Their mother's body on the floor, the sound of gunfire. The echo of commands shouted in panic. Seattle police quickly held a press conference, confirming that a woman armed with a knife had been shot by officers. They emphasized the officer's safety caution on her address. They repeated the claim that she had suddenly lunged at them. But to her family, those words were hollow. To her neighbors, they were excuses. The truth, for those who loved Charleena, was simple. A 30-year-old pregnant mother of 4 had called for help and ended up dead in her own apartment, killed in front of her children. The hours after the shooting were heavy with disbelief. News spread quickly across Seattle. A pregnant black woman, mother of 4, had been killed by police inside her own home at Bretler family place. By mid-afternoon, TV crews lined the streets. Microphones pressed against the faces of neighbors and relatives, who spoke through tears and anger about the woman they knew as Charleena. The Seattle Police Department gave its first statements cautiously, framing the shooting as a matter of self-defense. Officers Stephen McNew and Jason Anderson, the department said, had responded to a burglary call and had been suddenly confronted by a woman armed with a knife. They emphasized that Charleena's apartment had a caution flag in the system due to her prior contact with police, including a 2017 incident where she had allegedly threatened officers with scissors, but the narrative was challenged almost immediately. Critics pointed out the obvious. 2 armed, trained officers had faced a petite, pregnant woman in a small apartment filled with children. They had tasers. They had defensive training. Yet they had chosen to fire 7 bullets, killing her in front of her kids. To her family, neighbors, and community leaders, this was not policing. This was an execution. Charleena's family was devastated. Her father collapsed in grief when he learned the news, crying out that his daughter had called for help and been betrayed. Her sister, Monica Williams, stood before reporters the next day, her voice raw with pain. She was tiny. She was pregnant. They didn't have to shoot her. The children, still in shock, were left to process the trauma of having watched their mother's final moments in a blur of screams, gunfire, and blood. The outrage was immediate. By Monday, protesters gathered outside Seattle Police headquarters, chanting Charleena's name, demanding answers, and calling for justice. Signs reading "Justice for Charleena" and "Black Lives Matter" filled the streets. For many, her death was another example in a long pattern of systemic bias and brutality, especially against black women, whose stories were often overlooked. Seattle's mayor at the time, Ed Murray, promised a full investigation. The case was referred to the department's Force Investigation Team and later to the King County Prosecutor's Office. Body camera footage from both officers was released, showing the moments leading up to the shooting. In the footage, the scene appeared calm at first. Charleena speaking softly about the burglary, her children audible in the background. Then, a sudden escalation, officers shouting commands, and the crack of gunfire. The footage sparked even greater anger. Why had the officers not stepped back? Why had they not used tasers, which both were carrying? Why had they not called for crisis intervention specialists, given Charleena's known mental health struggles? The footage seemed to raise more questions than it answered. As investigations unfolded, the police union defended the officers, insisting they had been placed in a dangerous situation and had no choice. But activists countered that narrative, pointing to racial bias, lack of de-escalation, and the department's long history of excessive force. Seattle, after all, had been under a federal consent decree since 2012, after the Department of Justice found a pattern of unconstitutional policing. To many, Charleena's killing was proof that little had changed. Charleena's death also drew national attention. News outlets across the country reported on the case, comparing it to others like Breonna Taylor and Tashiana Jefferson. The story of a pregnant woman shot in front of her children resonated as a chilling indictment of American policing. Civil rights groups, including the ACLU and NAACP, demanded reforms. Her family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city of Seattle, arguing that the officers had failed in their duty to preserve life. In 2021, the city agreed to a $3.5 million settlement, money that would help support Charleena's children, but that could never replace their mother. For her sister Monica, the settlement was hollow. She said, "They took my sister's life. No amount of money can fix that." Legally, McNew and Anderson were never criminally charged. The King County Prosecutor's Office concluded that there was insufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officers had not acted in self-defense. To the community, this was another betrayal, another reminder of how the justice system shielded officers from accountability. But Charleena's legacy did not fade. In Seattle, her name became a rallying cry for police reform. Activists pushed for expanded crisis intervention training, demanding that officers be better equipped to handle mental health crises without resorting to deadly force. They called for more funding for social workers, mental health responders, and community-based safety programs that did not rely solely on armed police. Her story became part of a broader national conversation about the intersection of race, gender, and policing. Black women like Charleena were often forgotten in discussions about police violence, overshadowed by higher-profile cases involving men. But her death helped highlight how Black women, too, were disproportionately at risk, particularly women struggling with poverty, mental health, and motherhood. In Bretler Family Place, neighbors still remembered her. Murals appeared in the city, painted with her face alongside words of justice. Her children, now older, carried her memory with them, supported by relatives who promised to keep her spirit alive. Charleena Lyles should have been able to raise her children in peace. She should have been able to bring her baby into the world, to see her kids grow, to pursue her dreams despite hardship. Instead, her life was cut short by 7 bullets fired in a small apartment on a Sunday morning. Her death remains a wound in Seattle's conscience, a reminder of the stakes when systems fail to protect the vulnerable, a call to reimagine what safety truly means, and a testament to the enduring fight for justice in her name.